Good morning, everyone. My name is Rachel Fisher. I'm the Member Services Librarian at CCS. We're really excited to be able to sponsor a webinar today with Jay Colbert, a member of the editorial board and a librarian at University of New Hampshire. He will be presenting on cataloging with Homosaurus today. The live transcription from Zoom is available. There are settings at the bottom of the screen if you want to turn the subtitles on or off. And Jay, you are welcome to begin.
All right, thank you, Rachel. And hello, everyone. I was really excited to be asked to speak with y'all today. I'm actually from Illinois originally, so it felt nice to do some training for back home. So again, as Rachel said, today I will be giving a brief webinar on cataloging with the Homosaurus, and the little clever subtitle I chose to come up with was the who, what, when, why, and how of doing that. If you want to look at these slides online, especially after, I have put them in a GitHub repository that you can look at freely. The link is there. It's just in this folder here. And this is actually just a plain text presentation, so you don't need any specific software to look at it. So you can just look at the slides like this. And if you download the repository, you'll see there's an HTML file, and that's just what this is. So if you want to look at this later, you can feel free to do it that way. So the structure of this webinar today, like I said, will be the who, so who am I? The what is the Homosaurus, some brief history and context. The when, so this is going to be the part that probably takes up the largest amount of time, and that this is addressing some specific use cases, or when do you use what. This is also when I will go over things like when to use slang, as well as outdated or possibly derogatory or offensive language. This is also the portion where I would encourage a lot of interaction and asking questions. There is time for questions at the end, but I know that that will probably be where a lot of the questions lie. So feel free to ask them then, unless that's not a policy and Rachel doesn't want me to do that. Then we'll go into the why. So why is it important to use the Homosaurus, especially alongside other vocabularies? And then some more technical how questions. And that sort of go into, there's not a scope note. What do you do about that kind of thing? Then there will be another time for questions. And then the resources at the end, I have made a Zotero library. I can also send that information in a document, but it's just a Zotero library, which means I can add things to it should I think of them, or if you suggest them to me, and that will stay live and you can view it online. Are there any questions before I get started? Make sure I can see if any chats come in or anything. Nope. Okay, so to get started, who am I? So as Rachel said, and you actually got my last name correct, it's my name is J.L. Colbert, not Colbert. You have no idea how much I got made fun of in middle school for my last name. And my pronouns are he, him, his. I am the Metadata and Discovery Strategy Librarian at the University of New Hampshire. And what that broadly means is that I sort of come up with our direction and policy and vision for our metadata and discovery writ large at the University of New Hampshire. But I also manage our Primo VE discovery layer, which is sure fun. I'm also on the Homosaurus editorial board and have been since last year. I am not quite the newest member. We've added a few people after me, but I'm one of the newer members. However, I have been aware of and studied and used the Homosaurus since easily 2015 or 2016, because I studied it in graduate school for my master's thesis, as well as my 2 follow-up articles about that. And as a positionality statement, I am also white. And a lot of the sort of slurs and outdated terminology that I will discuss later refer to non-white, non-Western, indigenous cultures, or otherwise culturally specific. In fact, most people on the Homosaurus are white and from North America, if not the United States in general, even though it is an international vocabulary. So that is important framework to consider when talking about this. I am also queer and I am also transgender. So what is the Homosaurus? You've been using it, but what is it? So from its own website, the Homosaurus is an international linked data vocabulary of LGBTQ terms that supports improved access to LGBTQ resources within cultural institutions. And so that is not just libraries, that includes archives, museums, zine libraries, galleries, all sorts of things. Designed to serve as a companion to broad subject term vocabularies, the Homosaurus is a robust and cutting-edge vocabulary of LGBTQ specific terminology that enhances the discoverability of LGBTQ resources. And so the Homosaurus actually started in 1997. That's what we call version 0. And then it was just the thesaurus, the subject terms for the ILIA LGBT Heritage Collections, which is in Amsterdam. ILIA stands for International Homo Lesbian Information Center and Archives. And so originally it was just for that one specific collection, and it was fairly broad in that it wasn't just related to LGBTQ terms, it was for everything in their collections. But it was also narrow in some ways until 2013, almost 20 years later, when we officially get version 1 of the Homosaurus, which is when Jack Vanderwell at ILIA worked with Ellen Greenblatt to make it more inclusive. So originally it was sort of limited in that it mainly talked about gay and lesbian topics using that language. Whereas in 2013, that's when we add things like bisexual and transgender and intersex. They also added a hierarchical structure then. So before then it was fairly flat. And in 2013, it became more similar to something like the Library of Congress subject headings, where there's things like broader terms, narrower terms, related terms, things like that, like a more traditional subject vocabulary. And then over the next few years, it started to get more use outside of ILIA. So in 2015, KJ Rawson, who is one of our co-chairs and also the head of the Digital Transgender Archive, which was a very early adopter of the Homosaurus, he worked with Jack to transform version 1 into an online linked data vocabulary. So one, that's putting it online for other people to use, but also making it linked data, which the Library of Congress subject headings now are also linked data. But this way, it could sort of reference and map well to other vocabularies and also use a linked data structure instead of a more traditional subject heading structure. So one of the things that this allows us to do, if you've looked in the Homosaurus, you might notice this, is that you can have two things that are related terms, but they won't necessarily have the same broader term. So two things can be siblings without having the same parent in the Homosaurus. That its linked data structure allows us to do that. We aren't restricted by the way that Library of Congress is. And then 2016 was when the editorial board was established. And they decided to actually narrow the scope. So like I said, back since 1997, it sort of included any sort of terminology because it was its own thesaurus, and this was the only thesaurus ILIA used. So it had to include terms for all things. Where in 2016, it was more re-envisioned to act as a complement and supplement to other subject vocabularies. So this is why it is only LGBTQ specific terms in the Homosaurus and not things like dogs or things like that. It is not meant to replace Library of Congress subject headings. It is meant to act alongside it. And then 2019 was when version 2, so when you have the nice fancy website. Before then, it was like a Word document in PDF that lived on various people's computers. I remember when I was in grad school, my advisor was like, oh yeah, talk to K.R. Roberto. He's got it on his computer. And that was how the Homosaurus existed. 2019, it was put online, and that is where we are now. So this is the part where I would encourage a lot of participation and questions. If I don't see something just because it's hard to see where the chats are. Sometimes I'll make sure I'll pop that out a little bit. This is where I would want that, because this is addressing some of the specific questions and use cases I was asked to talk on. So the first is talking about when do you use various terms related to sex versus gender versus orientation, because these, while they are distinct concepts, are not always used as such, especially depending on who you're talking to or what you're cataloging. So sex, and you will see this in the Homosaurus terms, sex in parentheses body and sex assigned at birth. This refers to the biological sex of a person. So this will be things like secondary sex characteristics, which includes things like chromosomal makeup, hormone makeup, even things like genitalia, things like that. This is normally what you're referring to, at least in the West, when you are born and the doctor looks at you and says, this is a boy or this is a girl. That is normally what we're talking to when we refer to sex. Also, all living beings typically have sex based on these characteristics. So this is not necessarily just a human trait. But when you see it, that is how it's being used, is more biological or medical. Gender, however, and you'll see this in Homosaurus terms like gender identity, this refers more to the experience or internal feeling of a person. Sometimes you will see sex and gender used interchangeably. So you might see gender assigned at birth instead of sex assigned at birth. It can be used that way, not everyone does. And someone's gender identity might not necessarily be the same thing as the gender they were assigned at birth, or even their biological sex that they were assigned at birth. So you'll have things like transgender, which sort of broadly refers to someone not identifying with what they were assigned with at birth. But then you might have another term like transsexual, which, though a little outdated, enough people still use it. And that tends to refer more to a trans person using medical intervention in their transition. So transgender is more identifying most of the time. Transsexual will normally mean that person has gone through or is thinking about getting surgical procedures, hormonal replacement therapy, things like that. So sex is more about the physical body. Gender is more about experiencing gender within that body and a feeling. And then you'll have orientation. So orientation, and I see you have a question, I'll get to that in a second, thank you. Orientation, which you'll see in terms like sexual orientation or romantic orientation, and this one's gonna be hard to describe, refers to the direction, and I'm putting like air quotes around that, of an individual's attraction towards other individuals. So these are things like gay, bisexual, lesbian, asexual, aromantic, things like that. So if sex and gender are more about who you are, orientation is more about who you like. And then sexual orientation is different from romantic orientation in that sexual orientation is exactly what it sounds like. And romantic orientation is more about a romantic orientation, like who are you romantically attracted to? A lot of the times, but not always, these will be the same thing. You will have some people who experience split attraction. This is particularly common with individuals who are asexual and or aromantic. So you could have a gay man, for instance, who is also asexual, if that makes sense. And then I see I have a question, is this thesaurus being used to describe the voices of the authors, so the authors in addition to the subjects? That is a good question. One thing we say a lot in our editorial board meetings is that we are not the identity police. And there is often question of what is this vocabulary meant to describe? Is it describing people or is it describing the objects that are about people and that people make? And one of the great things about the Homosaurus is that you can adapt it to your needs. So if you are using the Homosaurus in cataloging, I would say you would use it to describe the subject of the book or whatever material you're cataloging, and not necessarily the person that wrote it or created it. However, if you're doing authority work, I'm also on the PCC working group that's doing the what you do about gender in name authority records. You can also use Homosaurus terms in name authority records as well. But if you're just doing subject cataloging, I would restrict it to the subject of the book. But if it's an autobiography or a memoir, then you are also perhaps describing the person who wrote it if they are writing about themselves. Does that answer your question? Or do you need me to expand on anything? Yes, okay. Any other questions before I move on to the next little topic? Was there any specific use cases that y'all have run into regarding when do you use things about sex versus gender versus orientation? And I can't see your hands raised because of my full screen and I can't see everyone. So you'll have to drop a chat, or Rachel will have to let me know.
If you have any questions, please type it in chat, and in the two drop-down menu, you can select everyone so everyone can see your question.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I will move on to the next then, but please, I can always come back to this later. So again, sex, gender, and orientation are often discussed as separate facets of a person's identity and experience, but not always. Especially with historical materials or historical identities, or even now, some people might have their gender and their sexual orientation be the same thing. If you ever run across materials about radical fairies, for instance, and I hope you do, radical fairies are amazing. They will often describe their sexuality and their gender and everything all as the same term. They weren't always, we didn't always break these terms apart like we do now. So if you are running into that in historical materials or something, just be aware that that might be the case, especially once we started getting sexologists and whatnot in the Victorian era. This is where you start getting things like third sex or things like that, where often being gay was the same thing as being transgender. So just be aware of that if you are cataloging older materials or materials about older identities. But the Homosaurus luckily does have vocabulary for a lot of those historical terms, so you won't necessarily need to make that distinction yourself. So next we're going to go over, and I know this is the big one, when do you use LGBTQ versus when do you use queer? So in general parlance, LGBTQ is the sort of umbrella term for what you might call the community of people who are all of these identities. So it stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, or questioning. You will see a million different variations of this acronym. And we are actually going to, the Homosaurus editorial board, we are going to be going through soon and cleaning up how we use the acronym and when we break it apart and what letters are in it soon. Mainly because we know there are inconsistencies within the vocabulary, and the person who had been doing a lot of the work of doing LGBTQ blank and then breaking it all up or whatever, that person sadly passed away last year. And a lot of those things don't have scope notes, so we are needing to go through and redo a lot of that anyway, sadly. Queer is both a distinct, and I'm putting air quotes on distinct, is a term that refers to sexual, like sexuality or gender identity. And it can also be used as a broader umbrella term for anyone who is LGBTQ. So it is both its own identity that can refer to sexuality and or gender, as well as a community umbrella term. I will talk about its use as a possibly offensive term later, because I know that is also a question people are having. So in the Homosaurus, we tend to find things about 3 different versions. You'll see term in parentheses LGBTQ. You'll see LGBTQ term. It's very helpful and clear, I know. And then you'll see queer term. What I'm about to tell you are recommendations. The Homosaurus gives no official instructions for how you use these. And although it does have hierarchy built in, it is not as strict as Library of Congress. And in any of the recommendations that I give you, I would always say, prefer what is best for your patrons and how they search over any hard or fast rules. This vocabulary is meant to be used by people in the way that they need. And if for some reason it's not working, I want you to break it. And if you have suggestions, you can let us know. But for instance, I saw, well, if people are searching queer to mean umbrella term, is it incorrect to use the queer term that is referring to the identity on something? And I would say no. It might not syntactically within the vocabulary be correct, but you're not going to break anything. So I would say if you think it will help your patrons find things, then do that. So use term LGBTQ broadly when you're using LGBTQ as an umbrella term. And I'll give an example, like a screenshot I took of a term within the Homosaurus to sort of explain this. Use LGBTQ term as a narrower term of that. That's how I tend to see it used, or if term LGBTQ is not available. Sometimes LGBTQ term is narrower than term LGBTQ, but sometimes not always. Sometimes it is the only version available, or sometimes it will be the narrower term if there are no other narrower terms, if that makes sense. So there are inconsistencies, definitely. I would say it wouldn't hurt to use them side by side if you think that will aid in discovery. But term LGBTQ tends to be more for like discussing something as a group, whereas LGBTQ term might be more about an identity, is the way that I see it used. Queer term tends to be referring to the identity of queer, sexuality or gender. It is normally a narrower term of LGBTQ, insert term here. But again, I saw one of the things that Rachel relayed to me was that, well, if people are searching queer to also mean community, is it incorrect to assign queer, queer like queer artists, for instance, if that term is actually technically referring to artists who identify as queer and not LGBTQ artists? And I would say, I don't think it's incorrect. Do what's best for your patrons. If you think that they're searching that way, there's not going to be anything that like invalidates in your catalog or anything. Remember how I said that with the Homosaurus, things can be narrower terms of something, but things can also be related terms and not have the same broader term. So even our own hierarchy is not strict, even within the Homosaurus itself. So it's meant to be flexible. And again, sometimes there won't be specific narrower identity terms. Sometimes LGBTQ term will be the narrowest. So in that instance, just use that. So here's a screenshot I took of the hierarchy display for Buddhists, LGBTQ. You'll see that one of its broader terms is LGBTQ Asian religions, which is vague. Does that mean it is a queer religion? I don't think that's a very good heading myself. And again, this is one of the things that over the next like year and so, and we have a grad student who's interning with us now. These are the kind of inconsistencies that we're wanting to fix and scope notes we're wanting to add. What do we mean by LGBTQ Asian religions, for example? But Buddhists, LGBTQ, that would be appropriate on a book that, say, is about queer Buddhists, as in, like, you know, it's not talking about any one specific type of queer person. It is just talking about Buddhists who are also queer. But then you'll see under that you have queer Buddhists referring to the identity queer, but also bisexual Buddhists, gay Buddhists, transgender Buddhists, and lesbian Buddhists. So it would be appropriate to assign transgender Buddhists, for example, to a book about or by Michael Dillon, who was the first transgender man to get phalloplasty and was also a Buddhist Lama, which is very fun information. So that's sort of the hierarchy, that is such a hard word to say, that you will see within the Homosaurus. But again, I encourage you to use these terms in a way that reflects how you see people searching for them and using them. We are not the police of how identity terms work. Before I move on to slang terms, are there any questions about using LGBTQ versus using queer? No? Okay.
No questions.
Oh, yes. Was there a question?
No, I haven't seen any questions yet.
Oh, okay. I thought I heard some. All right, so next, slang. This one, these are just my recommendations. I understand index integrity and not confusing patrons, since patrons can't see scope notes, is definitely a consideration here. So I like to demonstrate slang with my favorite joke of all time. William Shakespeare walks into a gay bar, exit pursued by a bear, which is a stage direction from his play A Winter's Tale. And bear also refers to a specific body type of and gender role of gay man, where they are very big and hairy. So that's how I like to demonstrate our slang. So again, as you can see, some queer slang uses common words that mean other everyday normal things. For example, bears or other animals refer to specific body types, sexual identities, or gender roles in gay culture. The term stud might refer to a masculine Black lesbian, for example. Cruising does not mean anything to do with cars. Things like that. And I think it is still important to use these terms when cataloging. They are important, inherent aspects of queer culture and history, and often other terms are not correct when speaking about these concepts. They have these words, often for historical reasons of trying to speak under common language in a way that maybe authority figures might not recognize. Oh, they're just talking about cottages. You know, they're not talking about anything else. Luckily, if it's alongside a Library of Congress term, the Library of Congress term will be worded differently. So let me move my chat out of the way. So the version of the term in other vocabularies might actually be structured differently, worded differently, or even excluded entirely. And so an example I like to use of why it might be important and when to use these slang terms, even if they are common words that have other meanings, is, so the Homosaurus has bears, but it also has otters. Otters is in that same realm of using animals to describe specific body types for gay men, and it is different than what a bear is. Library of Congress has bears, and in parentheses, gay culture. So, you know, Homosaurus doesn't have bears, the animal. It just has bears, so there's no need to be redundant with putting gay culture. Library of Congress just has bears, so it is required, you know, it's necessary to put that it is in gay culture. But it doesn't have otters as its own term. It says that otters is a variant term of bears, when bears and otters are not the same thing at all. So that is actually an incorrect like judgment call on the Library of Congress's part. So if you are cataloging a book that maybe is about otters in the gay slang sense, it would be incorrect to use the Library of Congress term bears that specifies that this is gay culture. Whereas it would be correct to use the Homosaurus version of that, even though it is vague and does not specify that it is gay culture. And there are no other terms I can think of that you might use to describe that specific thing. Any questions about slang and why it might be important to use or how it might be handled differently by the Library of Congress? I used to teach and I used to do instruction for freshmen, so trust me, I can outweight you. Okay, so this next section will include terms. Oh, yes, it does seem important for natural language searching. I agree. I noticed also Rachel was brought up to me things about people searching Latinx, where Library of Congress has that. And I've seen other presentations where people talk about that being an increasing term that people are searching that Library of Congress does not have, but Homosaurus does. So yes, it does help with natural language searching, definitely. And I know people aren't really clicking on subject headings anymore. I mean, I do, but that's because, I'm a librarian. But I'm assuming even if it's a similar term, it's going to only bring up other things with that term and not just everything that contains bear, unless it's primo, and who knows how primo works half the time. I sure don't, and I manage it. So with outdated or derogatory terms, some of the terms that I might show or even say might be considered potentially harmful or offensive, and I include them only in an educational, informational way. So FYI. So Homosaurus has a term that is LGBTQ historical terms, and under it, as narrower terms, it does include a list of what might be considered historical terms. And its scope note, it actually has a scope note, I was amazed, is historical terms for LGBTQ people, identities, and practices that are now considered outdated and or offensive. So just because something is outdated does not necessarily mean it is also offensive, but it probably could be. And there were so many of them, I had to take 2 screenshots for them to fit all on the slide. So you'll see a lot of these are various terms, either that are slurs or some that are actually intra-community slang that's just maybe outdated now. So for instance, I don't know why banji is necessarily under historical, but that's a popular term in ball culture. So if you've seen like Paris is Burning or Pose, it's a term from that culture. Whereas homophiles was a term largely used in the first half of the 20th century by gay men as a way to push back against sort of the medicalization of homosexual, for instance. Some of these I would say are still in use today. They might not be the most popular, but things like FTM and MTF are still terms that some trans people will still use. So these are more historical terms that you might still have reason to use, but probably not a lot. Slurs, and again, slurs is a Homosaurus term that has some narrower terms that I would consider to be slurs. So if you need a list, there they are. And its scope note is rather large. And I think it's one we added recently. And it is insulting or discriminating remarks, innuendos, or names intended to demoralize a person, which are usually based on that person's belonging to a particular social group. Typically, for a term to be considered a slur, it must be derogatory towards a particular person or group. It must be used to subordinate them within some structure of power relations, and the derogated person or group must be defined by an intrinsic property, such as race, sexual orientation, gender identity, etc. This category includes terms considered slurs at any point in their usage, which means, and this is important, therefore, some of these terms may no longer be considered necessarily derogatory. They may be in common usage, or they may be selectively reclaimed by certain groups. And here is all of the ones that are listed in Homosaurus. All of these but two, I would say, are terms that are anthropological and refer to indigenous or non-Western or culturally specific identities. Those, I would say, should not be used at all. We include them in the Homosaurus, especially because archives are a huge consideration for assigning these terms. But most of the things that Homosaurus would consider slurs are actually slurs against indigenous peoples. Most other identity terms, especially Western, things like lesbian, gay, those have been used derogatory. I was in school when That's So Gay was still a huge thing. So just because something has been used in a derogatory fashion doesn't necessarily mean it's a slur or that you shouldn't use it. Queer, I know, is a big one that there's a lot of discourse about that right now. I would say that the choice to use the Homosaurus is itself a political one, and therefore any term you use in it comes from a political perspective. And the discourse about queer as a slur, you shouldn't use it, largely comes out of transphobic communities. Radical feminists, trans-exclusionary radical feminists particularly, are normally the people leading the crusade against the term queer, because it allows for identities and ways of being that don't necessarily fit nicely into boxes or taxonomies. Obviously, people can be okay, like they can be not okay with using it and don't like it for themselves. And I would say don't necessarily assign queer as an identity term on something just because the author identifies that way, or they identify as, say, lesbian, and you think adding queer to it would be useful even if the book's not about that, for example. But I would say that queer is as much of a slur now as like gay might be, and the discourse about it is largely fueled by transphobia and prejudice against sex workers, because it also used to refer to sex workers as well. And there has been a lot of overlap between trans people and sex workers historically. So it may be appropriate to use historical terms for materials, which themselves may or may not be historical. I know there was a big queer Victorian romance novel genre out there. And it can be appropriate to assign these terms if the materials themselves discuss the identities using those terms. So if it is a book about homophiles, it would be appropriate to use the homophile subject heading. If it is something discussing Uranism or Uranians, which was a Victorian term that was basically a woman born in a man's body, and that's why that man is gay. Oscar Wilde's partners tended to be called Uranians. It would be appropriate to use Uranian or Uranism. And this is particularly true in archival contexts, or again, when an item describes itself with those terms. It is rarely appropriate to use slurs, especially if you're not in an archive. I would say err on the side of caution and don't. However, again, some historical terms are also slurs or were slurs, but they are largely reclaimed now. So I used queer as an example, but dykes is another one. And and it is a term for lesbians and other queer women that can be used in a derogatory way. But it is also often used among queer women, particularly as a self-identifier. For some people, dykes is both a sexuality and a gender, for example. And therefore, it might be appropriate to assign dykes to something such as Dykes to Watch Out For by Alison Bechdel. And when in doubt, especially for terms referring to Indigenous peoples or culturally specific identities, do not use a term classified as a slur. Even if it might improve discovery, just don't do it. If a historical term or slur that would be appropriate refers to Indigenous peoples or culturally specific identities, consider using other subject vocabularies if they exist. And I include some Indigenous vocabularies in the resources link that I'll give out. And also, if it is a material about a tribe local to you, reach out to members of that local tribe to see how they wish to be described, if at all. I know in a lot of Indigenous communities, there are exonyms versus endonyms. So the exonym is the word used by outsiders of that tribe to describe them. So something like Navajo, versus the endonym, which is the word used inside to describe themselves, which would be Diné, for instance. I got a question. What are my thoughts on flattening some of these hierarchies? For example, by making queer 450 of LGBTQ or vice versa. I think it's important to recognize that many, especially younger folks, use these words interchangeably. I think that's fine. Again, the way that the Homosaurus structures itself is different than the Library of Congress does. We don't, because we're a linked data vocabulary, we aren't doing the 100s and the 450s and all that. Like I said, there's a lot of inconsistencies in how our hierarchy is structured. And again, I know that's something we're going to be changing. So if it makes sense in your catalog to flatten that hierarchy, I would say go for it. I think that's a good idea because it means you're paying attention to how your patrons are searching or imagining ways that they might be searching. And I think that's a good thing. No problem. Good question. So before I move on to the more just like why and brief how, and I see we have about 15 minutes left. I think it was only an hour, right? I didn't dream that. Are there any more like when do you use what type questions that I may have overlooked or you want me to revisit, clarify? Nope. Okay. So, and I'm so glad to see that y'all are already considering this and thinking about this. The reason why it's so important to use these terms is like thinking about how are your patrons searching for materials? You know, is someone going to be using sexual minorities to search for something about the LGBTQ community? No, they are not. But there is not an LGBTQ subject heading in Library of Congress. There were sexual minorities and there was gender minorities. Factually correct, I guess, but it's no real person searches for things that way, right? People are going to be searching for queer or they're going to be searching for LGBTQ. So that is one reason why it's so important to use the Homosaurus. And, and if you how are you seeing that patrons are searching for your materials? Do you get keyword search logs? Do you have Primo VE and you can see the like top whatever search terms? And it's not just your instruction librarians showing people how to use the catalog. Have you done usage studies? Have you talked to reference librarians to see how they are interacting with patrons and teaching them or questions they're getting? Who is the patron in your head that you're imagining searching for things and the way that they're searching for things? Who is that patron and who is left out in whatever patron you have in your head or whatever studies that you've done? Who is the patron that you are cataloging for? Are you cataloging for the squeaky wheel who emails you all the time? Are you cataloging for the loudest group? Are you cataloging for the person who doesn't know how to use the catalog and that's why there's no searches from them? That kind of thing. This sort of relates to one of our philosophies in the Homosaurus of how we even add terms. So we don't use literary warrant in the Homosaurus. There is no hypothetical cataloger getting a book on their desk and going, oh, hey, there's not a term for this. I better add one to the Homosaurus. A lot of times it is us just paying attention to the language that we ourselves use or maybe see in scholarship or can imagine happening. Are there a bunch of books about lesbian Buddhists? I don't know, but we can imagine a use case for that. So can you imagine that someone might search for something a certain way? Then it's important to use the Homosaurus in that way. So Homosaurus terms are meant to complement and supplement existing vocabularies, such as Library of Congress subject headings. And one of the things that's great about it is that some of its terms are based on current popular inter-community language, but others are from other semantic realms, such as medical language. We have a biologist on our editorial board, and if you see any sort of medical language, it's largely coming from her. And there are medical terms that have analogous non-medical terms in the Homosaurus. And because those are different contexts, we can have them, we put them both instead of Library of Congress, where you might only allow one warrant for a term, because you can only have one term to mean one concept in Library of Congress. So that's another reason why the Homosaurus is so great, is it might be appropriate. You might be cataloging a book that's more biological or medical and to use one of those medical terms. But if you think that someone might search for it using another term that's outside of that medical realm, there's also probably another Homosaurus term for that, especially relating to identity. And then here's some more sort of nitty-gritty how questions. So what to do when there aren't scope notes, which is most of the time. We know that there aren't scope notes, and we are changing that. We actually got a grant to hire a grad student to go through and do a lot of scope notes. We just had an event at the LD4 conference last week that was just, hey, let's write scope notes together. And we got about 200 of them written, I think. So don't worry, we're working on it. And all new terms that we add, do have scope notes. It's just a lot of the old ones don't. And Elizabeth says there does seem to be contradiction with LC terms like sex role. So supplementation does seem important. Yes, I agree. One of the things that Library of Congress lacks is some of these nuances that might exist in certain contexts that Homosaurus allows, but because of this sort of more rigid structure of LC, those aren't there. Definitely, good point. So some of the resources that we use for scope notes, there is no official, like you have to cite something when you write a scope note, but we tend to use a lot of online resources. So there's a lot of like community wikis out there. And again, these aren't the like, there's no non-binary president who decides what goes in the non-binary wiki. But if you're maybe confused about gender terms that aren't just man, woman, stuff like that, the non-binary wiki is a good place to look. The Asexuality Visibility Network wiki is really good for terms about sexuality that refer to asexuality. Gonna move the chat out of the way. There's the LGBT Wikia, which again is another just sort of wiki that's for LGBT stuff in general that includes a lot of stuff about identity. There's the Transgender Language Primer. And just all of this language is changing all of the time. So that is another thing to consider. That is one of the hardest things about working on this vocabulary, is that people will use things in different ways. And it's always changing all the time. So that is actually why these like community resources can be really good, as they are updated more frequently. But also the Homosaurus, we do have meetings every month and we do update things as needed. We aren't draconian like LC, where it takes 15 million years and you have to write a dissertation on why your term should be accepted or changed. Then there's also the BDSM and kink glossary, but note that this site may contain material that is considered not safe for work. If only you could sit in on our editorial board meetings when we have to go through some of these terms sometimes. I feel bad for the people who don't have their own offices. I find it very fun though. Subdivisions was another huge one. And I'm sorry to say that Homosaurus does not have subdivisions. That is not the way our vocabulary is structured. And I'm not sure how Mark deals with mixing subdivisions and then terms from different vocabularies in the same field. But what I would recommend, and again, do what works best for your institution, but this is inspired by what the University of Kentucky does, is that you can use a Homosaurus term just on its own, but alongside an LCSH term that has a form subdivision on it. So an example I was given was the lesbian relationships Homosaurus term. So if you have a book, like a fiction book that's about lesbian relationships, you could definitely use the Homosaurus lesbian relationships in the 650, and then add another 650 using the Library of Congress lesbian couples and do the form subdivision fiction. And my cataloging professor, Bobby Bothman, would give me an F right now for mistyping my little subdivision there. You can also use Homosaurus terms as a 655 alongside that. So you could use lesbian fiction, another Homosaurus term, as a 655 alongside the lesbian relationship 650 and the lesbian couples fiction 650. And I see there's a question. I didn't look at the source yet, so I'm not sure about this. Oh, I mentioned lesbian Buddhists. Are there terms as lesbian Catholics, lesbian doctors, etc.? Yes, there are. Not always, but we try to, if we're going to do an identity, noun kind of thing, we try to do it for all of them that we can think of, at least with the main LGBTQ acronym. So definitely there's stuff like that. And if there's not, feel free to suggest it. But we try to build those out anytime we do an identity. Good question. And again, if you are cataloging something and you go, oh, I don't see a term for this in the Homosaurus or Library of Congress or anywhere, or my friend has started using this term, maybe the Homosaurus should add that as a term, or I've seen this used elsewhere. It's very easy to suggest terms for us. I'm gonna move things out of the way here. This is our contact form. You can give feedback, you can report, broken links, and you can suggest terms in here as well. That's how a lot of our terms get added when we're not working on our own little personal projects, is someone emails us and goes, oh, hey, could you add xenogender? I think it would be good if you added xenogender. And then we research it as a board and we decide on whether or not we should add that. And then we create it and then it gets added. You don't have to, I know for Library of Congress, you have to submit the record that would be proposed along with all of your sources and stuff to get it considered, and you don't have to do that with us. We recognize that people don't have time for that and we're not as strict as that. We write our authority records in shared Google documents and then we add them to our link data software. Other questions? I see we don't have much time left. So is there anything else that you have questions about, wanted me to cover on? That is my email address. You can always feel free to email me after. And then this is the Zotero library that Al created. I'll drop this in the chat, actually. And again, if you click on that, I'm gonna move things out of the way. There we go. It just takes you to my Zotero library, so you can snoop on other things I'm working on. But this includes Indigenous knowledge organization, all of the little resources I talked about. It includes links to various controlled vocabs resource lists. Someone at the University of Kentucky did a great presentation at LD4 last week on how the University of Kentucky is using the Homosaurus. And so I've included that YouTube link in here because LD4 has made those public. So I highly recommend watching that. They're doing some great stuff over there. And that was all I had. So yes, please, if you have more questions, comments, concerns, I'm here.
Thank you so much, Jay, for your presentation. It was really very helpful.
And I'll drop my GitHub repository in the chat as well. Oh, I messaged someone privately. There we go. And again, it's just plain text. I wrote this in a .org file if we got any plain text nerds watching today. And it's all the same information, just as one plain text document. So you can view it right on my GitHub. You can download it and open it in any software that will, read plain text.
It does not look like we have any more questions.
Okay. And I hope the things you wanted me to address on, because I know those are really tricky semantic when you use queer versus LGBTQ, and I know our lack of scope notes doesn't help. So I'm glad y'all were thinking about that and when to use those. That warms my heart. So I hope me going over that a little bit gave some clarity. But again, if there's one thing I want you to take away, it's this vocabulary is meant to be used. And so use it in the way that works best for you and your patron base. And if that includes breaking a few rules, I'm not going to tell on you. So. And I'm sorry my cat didn't show up. I'll put a little picture of him in the GitHub repository.
And for those who have joined us that are not members of CCS, I will find a link to what we've started to work on for our cataloging manual page. In case you're interested in reading it, it's still a draft and has not been approved yet. But you're welcome to take a look at what we've begun to work on. So thank you everyone for joining us today from CCS and all of the other libraries. I think we had 41 libraries who registered to come to the event today, and not just the 28 from CCS. So I'd like to thank everyone for coming. I will make the video available online and send it out to all of the registrants as soon as I can. I'm gonna stop recording.